Good morning from London and welcome everybody to this webinar on education and gender. My name is David Taylor and I'll be acting as the moderator for the event. The webinar is the fourth in a series that focuses on the impact of COVID-19 on social and economic development in Pakistan. But the issues that we're discussing are of much more general importance and significance both to Pakistan and to other countries. The webinar is being organized by two institutions. The Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilisations, based in London and part of Aga Khan University, which is an international university founded in Pakistan in 1983 by His Highness the Aga Khan. The second institution is Bloomsbury, Pakistan, and Bloomsbury, Pakistan is a London-based charity which acts as a research and resource centre bringing together scholars based in Pakistan, the UK and elsewhere. And if you're interested, you can find out more information on both institutions on their respective websites. And I've been associated with both institutions for a number of years, both in London and Karachi, and I'm delighted to introduce our two panelists today. The first speaker will be Professor Anjum Halai, who is based at AKU in Karachi, where she is Vice Provost Asia and UK, and also Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. She's an international education specialist with extensive experience of leading and managing large international research and development projects in Pakistan and East Africa. And her research, as we'll see, to exclusion on the basis of language, gender, or conflict. And she has a grassroots level of understanding of gender issues as they play out in teaching and learning, especially in mathematics, which is often seen as a masculine subject. Our second speaker will be Dr. Huma Baqai, who is Associate Dean, Faculty of Business Administration, and Associate Professor of Social Sciences and Liberal Arts at the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi. She has worked with national and international media as an international relations and political expert and analyst since 1999. She's a familiar figure on current affairs programs on Pakistan television and has become a prominent public intellectual thanks to her insightful analyses of conflict in the country. And she is a member of the Advisory Council on Foreign Affairs, chaired by the Foreign Minister of Pakistan. Anjum and Huma will each speak for a few minutes on aspects of the topic, and after each presentation, I will ask a couple of follow-up questions and invite the other panelists to do the same. And after this, we'll open up the discussion for questions. And to ask a question, all you have to do is to use the comments box on Facebook. And also for your information, the whole session is being recorded and will be available on Facebook and on the ISMC and Bloomsbury Pakistan websites if you want to go back to it or to share it with other friends and colleagues. So I think it's very well known that gender disparities in access to education, length of time spent, and in outcomes are very serious problems. And in some respects, they are particularly acute in Pakistan. One just needs to look at the figures for female literacy in South Asia, and Pakistan is at the bottom above only Afghanistan. And we want to find out what is it that has created this situation. So I'd like to begin by asking Anjum to look at the issues in broad social and historical perspective. Anjum.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum and good day. And David, thank you for the opening remarks. I would say gender is relevant to the education narrative generally, and much more importantly in patriarchal societies such as Pakistan, where opportunities for education, development, and progress are differentiated along the lines of gender. Why is gender important to education is also a strategic decision, particularly in low-income countries such as Pakistan and the region where the Aga Khan University works. Women, if they are better educated, they tend to be healthier. They are in the formal employment sector. They will, because of being in the formal employment sector, they bring in higher income. They tend to marry late, have smaller families, and in their families, they would take better care for their well-being and access to education. all of these factors come together, they would lift the individual, the family, the community, and the nation out of poverty. So gender and women's education in that context becomes an important part of the education narrative. I would say when we are talking about in the current pandemic, and I know my colleague Huma will speak about it in more detail, I was looking at a study conducted by colleagues in LUMS who tracked the educational loss of students, a longitudinal study over a 4-year period, educational loss in the context of the 2005 earthquake in Pakistan. And interestingly, their finding was that educational loss was greater for children who were closer to the fault line as compared to those families who were distant from the fault line. That's easy to understand. But what was interesting was that in their finding, the educated mothers wiped out about half of the negative effect of being closer to the fault line. Now you extrapolate from that finding, that was a devastation from the 2005 earthquake and the learning loss which the teachers, students, educators, community had to take into account when young people came back to school. And at around 15 September, if things go well, Pakistan's school education system will also be looking at students coming back to school, and we can see how mothers' education comes into play in whatever the learning loss would be and how educators would be dealing with it. David, you asked about Pakistan. Pakistan is a very good example of why we should be making gender an explicit part of the education conversations around education. It's a country of about 220 million people. And since its creation, we just celebrated our 73rd Independence Day. Since its creation, we have made significant advances as compared to our mothers and grandmothers. Young women today are more likely to be able to access education, more likely to be able to access formal employment, have better access to healthcare. About 20% of our seats in the parliament are occupied by women. If you look at education, the literacy rates, although the lowest, but have still shown a marked literacy rate for women, which used to hover around 25% at the time of independence, are now hovering around 50%. So there's that progress. In higher education, if you look at the most populous province, Punjab, 50% of the enrollment in higher education is women, but we still have a long way to go. We still have a long way to go because these advantages, so for example, the enrollment, 50%, only 10% converts into employment in the formal sector. We need to look at the structure of the Pakistan education system to be able to understand why some of these disparities are continuing. So Pakistan is a very highly gender segregated society with very traditional roles and relationships built into the fabric of how the societal modes and traditions work. And the education system, particularly the education system in the public sector, which is the largest provider at the post-primary level, it's gender segregated, but much more so at the post-primary levels. And if you look at the statistics provided in on the government National Education Statistics 2018, and over the period, you will see consistently fewer schools for girls as compared to boys, consistently. And that becomes more acute at the secondary school levels. There's a study by Oxford colleagues conducted in the context of Pakistan, which says that to be able to overcome the impact of culture, for women to be able to enter into the formal employment sector, they would need at least 8 to 10 years of education, at least. And depending on which study you have the statistic on, this study says only about 19% would have completed their education of 8 to 10 years. So now you extrapolate fewer number of schools, secondary schools, elementary schools, but you need at least 8 to 10 years of education, complete education for young women to be able to access those advantages of education that I mentioned earlier on. And then if you look at, I mean, so far, I'm just talking about access in the school education system. The girls' school, or fewer, there is a persistent shortage of teachers, and that shortage of teachers is not uniform. It is more acute in rural, disadvantaged girls' schools, and much more so in STEM subjects, in science, physics, and mathematics. And so you can imagine that STEM subjects are the gateway for opportunity. We just heard yesterday, for example, that a brilliant Pakistani woman became the dean of the MIT in US, Nargis Mawalwala from Karachi. So it's not that these young women are not able to learn mathematics or physics or pursue advanced careers in these subjects. It's a matter of opportunities. And so far, I've just spoken about school education system. If you look at the out-of-school children, 22 million or 25 million or somewhere in that range, it's a huge number. And of these, 49% are girls as compared to 40% in boys. But I would like to make another important point that so far we spoke about access. Access is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for gender equity and for the merits of the education to be trying to lift the society, the community, the country out of poverty. What is the quality of education that we are talking about? If the education process just perpetuates the status quo, then the same patriarchal modes, the patriarchal conditions that are prevalent in the society would repeat itself time and again. So how do we break that vicious cycle? It should be an important part of an education process that enables the questioning of the status quo. And that, for me, is a very important consideration for an education that looks at how do we open up the opportunities. In this case, we are talking about gender equality and equity, but this would also be true for a broader sense of inclusion. Can we do something about it? I would say yes. There are many things that we can do, and many of those things I would be happy to say we are also doing. So teachers, as classrooms are microcosms of society, and very often they will perpetuate the same traditions and norms. And as I said, we need to break that vicious cycle. Teachers could play a crucial role, and therefore a teacher education that enables teachers to take on a problem solving and an inquiry approach in their practice. The modern approaches to teacher preparation and continuing teacher education should be adopted for our classroom dynamics to change, so that the students, the girls, and the boys can have an education that enables them to think and question the status quo. So that's one area where we can change. Curriculum materials consistently convey messages that have lower expectations for girls as compared to boys. We need to critique, question, and wean out the implicit bias from our curriculum materials and textbooks. That's something that we can do. If we look at, in the context of the not-for-profit sector, education sector in Pakistan, there are strong examples of fairly large school systems that have looked at how to enable those who are in the most remote, poverty-ridden, rural, difficult to access areas, and girls to access education. I'll name two examples. The Aga Khan Educational Services Pakistan and globally, and the Citizens Foundation are two school systems that we are very proud of, and these have been positively evaluated. They reach out to the poorest of the poor, and within their systemic structures, they build in policies and procedures to enable and encourage the girls to enter into education and to complete the education cycle. So, for example, research has shown that distance of the home from the school matters for girls to participate. Research has shown, and it's I would say, why do we even need research for it, that having a toilet within the boundary walls of the school will really facilitate girls' participation in the education process and their continued attendance, particularly for adolescent girls who this is an important factor. Research, all right, David, I have seen your message for time, so I will talk about other remedial factors and issues that we can take out, that we can take into account to address some of the equity issues in the education system, if time permits. Thank you. David, you are on mute.
Myself, thank you very much for that very comprehensive survey. And I guess one of the most important things that comes out of it is, as it were, the vicious circles. And I see two vicious circles here. One is generational, the importance, the virtuous circle of mothers who are educated and who see their girls as equally deserving, and all the consequences that flow from that in terms of life experience and opportunities. And equally, of course, the vicious circle that goes in the other direction. And then there's the vicious circle that has to do with the culture of schooling, and particularly perhaps in the rural areas, where to get teachers to go to village schools for salaries that are minimal, in conditions that are extremely poor, where they're the subject of local landlords dominating, telling them what to do. Inevitably, that reproduces itself in the quality of the education that's given to the pupils. What has been the impact of urbanization? I mean, this was at the background, I think, of several of the things you said, that people coming to live in cities have more opportunities. There are more opportunities for, say, the Citizens Foundation to set up schools, or for other organizations. But there's also the impact, and thanks, Steve, for mentioning this, the impact of people returning from the Middle East, where gender stereotypes may reinforce some of the vicious cycles at work, the expectations of girls and girls' education. So I just wondered if you could respond to that.
Thank you. Very important points. One thing that I would like to bring to notice, and it's a positive shift, there is really a shift in the attitudes of the communities and parents. It is no longer true that parents and communities do not want their girls to be educated through a formal schooling process. How do we know that? We find private sector, for example, will go where the need is. Private sector will go where the demand is. And there is a proliferation of private sector. About 40% of enrollment in the primary sector is in the private schools. And that's where the niche is. So parents are willing to send their children to schools, both daughters and sons. And they are also willing to send them to co-educational institutions, because most private schools are co-educational. So that cultural shift is coming. To your question about whether schooling, what about schooling in the rural areas, the two exemplars that I gave you of the school systems are those which go out to the most remote, the disadvantaged, and the poverty-ridden communities. And what I'm saying, that we can learn from these systems. So the Citizens Foundation and the Aga Khan Educational Services, they take the school to where the need is. So one of the features, for example, to encourage young women and girls to complete education is the distance of the school from the home. And so you go to the remotest mountain areas of Chitral and you will find a school there. Not that the children will have to travel to either Gilgit or to Chitral in the northern areas. The schools have gone there. So that phenomenon is also important. And within that, you spoke about breaking the vicious cycle of how the teachers might perpetuate certain cultural norms. So there are approaches to preparing teachers and continuing teacher education where we can enable the teachers themselves to have higher expectations for girls. I mean, I'm very, in my research, I've seen, and because my work has been mostly in mathematics classrooms, I've seen teachers sometimes say, what will you do? In Urdu, they would say, तुम्हें क्या जरूरत है कैलकुलस पढ़ने की? तुमने तो चूल्हा संभालना है. Why do you need to study calculus? You are a homemaker. But now if the teachers begin to reflect on how education has changed their lifestyle and how they encourage the young women who are their students to have higher expectations and aspirations from themselves, then that vicious cycle can be broken. Yeah. And as I said, the issues that Steve pointed out about the feudal culture, the interference in the governance of the schools, I would say it's a chicken and egg situation, but it's an educated mind, education of the high quality kind, the questioning kind, that would help break these vicious cycles. With an education that just receives the status quo, we are not talking about that education.
Yeah, thanks very much. Huma, did you want to come in at this point with in dialogue with Anjum?
So I thoroughly enjoyed Anjum's talk, and the insights were absolutely great. I would like to actually just bring in another dimension. So while we in Pakistan and probably in other developing countries grapple with everything that Anjum Halai just said, COVID-19, the pandemic happened. And what the pandemic did was that it has created the largest disruption of education system the history has ever witnessed, affecting nearly 1.6 billion learners in more than 190 countries and all the continents. 94% of world's student population, up to 99% in low and lower income countries, lower middle income countries. So where does this leave a country like Pakistan, which Anjum absolutely correctly said that it's a patriarchal society, there are constraints, we are still grappling with change, we are still grappling with norms that prevent women, and the disparities are almost unbelievable. Take it from our mortality rates to our enrollment rates. So perhaps what education in countries like Pakistan is that it's a lifeline. It's a lifeline. And I'm not talking about tertiary education. I'm not talking about STEM, science and mathematical education. I'm talking about basic education, something like grade 8, 9th and 10th. It's a lifeline for a lot of people, Pakistan also being the youngest country in the world. So it's a lifeline against, it shields them against violence. It shields them against or mitigates against harmful gender norms. And most importantly, education for girls in Pakistan is hope. So it allows them to just think beyond the box that they're boxed into, and something that they're not even allowed to think beyond. So that's what education does. It gives them an alternative, an option, hope. And what saddens me, or what scares me, is that they say that the pandemic may reverse 20 years of gains made for girls' education. 20 years of gains. So the gains that Anjum just spoke about, which are not very good. There is so much more that needs to be done. All of that could be reversed. And of course, because it is impacting 99% of the impact will be taken by developing countries. So it's countries like Pakistan.
Okay, before we'll come to COVID specifically later on, I was just wondering if Anjum wanted to respond to that initial set of points.
Sure.
Thank you, Huma. I agree that education is the lifeline for the girls, for women. for those who are poor, because I think gender also interacts very strongly with poverty. I would also say that COVID-19 brings for us opportunities, and at least two opportunities I would like to take note of. One is it has created a turning point where everybody is sitting up to take note and say, what is it that we have to do? How do we make sure that we do not make the same mistakes again? So even sitting up to take notice and do something about it is an advantage that COVID-19 is bringing to us at this point. The second one, I would say that, and this happened in Pakistan, and I guess it also, I believe it also happened in other countries, that many schools and particularly higher education institutions had to do a quick turnaround and make advancements in their provision of online technology and blended learning arrangements. Now, of course, we can talk about the digital divide. We can talk about the inequities that are persistent in the digital access, but it does also mean that there is an opportunity for us to take education to those areas where, for example, if young women were not allowed to leave their homes and to go to formal education institutions, then education can come to their homes. So that COVID, I agree with you, brings devastation, but it is also opening up opportunities for us to rethink and think out of the box.
Great. May I respond to that, David?
Yeah.
Okay, so absolutely right. And I wish I had your optimism, Anjum, because I sit in an elitist school, so to say. We did 2 semesters online, and we realized that it's not about far-flung areas. It is here in Karachi that it was not a right and not a given. It was a privilege because of accessibility to internet and because of the availability of electricity. And I think that is what we need to look at. So yes, we can talk about conscious capitalism, but my take from the COVID-19 situation is, in all the reports that I've looked at, is that education is a privilege in countries like Pakistan. It is not a right. And when we talk about this going online, blended learning, hybrid systems, I also see that as a function of elite schools. Because what happened to most schools? What happened to 90% schools and even public sector universities? They got used to not going to school. They got used to not going to the universities. They started staying home. And this was complicated by the economic recession that the country faces with a negative 1.25 growth rate, which means there is a demand for child labor. People are getting used to these girls or boys also that used to go to school to bringing in some extra money, and they're getting hooked to it and are getting used to it. So the biggest challenge is that will these girls who stayed home, were going to school, will they be able to go back to school? I'm not even coming to the point of blended learning or its opportunity of taking this to far-flung areas. I see it actually bringing it back to the situation that existed. Because if I share these statistics with you, rural areas and urban slums are at the highest risk, where maximum disenrollment will happen and maximum number of girls will not go back to school after COVID-19. So we actually went and we spoke to these people in the Basti, and they said that my husband has lost his job. I used to do some cottage work at home. That income is gone. My only income is from my 14-year-old, my 13-year-old, and my 15-year-old going out and doing cheap labor and bringing food on the table. I think that is going to have a repercussion and an impact on our education system, which we will have to fight for years. And yes, SAS and SHIFT of World Bank and Asian Development Bank have given huge amounts of money to countries like Pakistan to mitigate this impact. But you see, there is this very critical, and which you understand more than I do, and I'm sure our listeners do. You see, so there's this gender and power relation which limits your access to resources. And then more importantly, how these resources are spent. So in a country where education for the girl was not important to begin with, this gap, this sort of interruption is going to have repercussions, which we will have to have very specific focused response to. I don't think that there is a study which is looking at girls who will be able to go back to school. I'm not even talking about the digital divide here. I'm talking about the ground reality, which is so glaringly not pretty. And that is so, as much as I would like to see this as an opportunity, I see it as a crisis.
Yeah. Well, your comment about the difference between public and private sectors is echoed in the United Kingdom, that in our state schools, there's been much less opportunity for children to go online and continue to attend school online compared to the private schools, i.e. the public schools as we call them here. Although fortunately it hasn't had some of the other more long-term consequences perhaps that you're hinting at. Okay.
This is one more point I wanted to make, David. You see, this whole system of children going to school, it stabilizes the society. It allows middle class parents to go to work. It divides the day into where the work of taking care is done by the schools. All of that was disrupted. And this disruption is not going away. Because, you know, even I sit at a very elitist school, and we've delayed our semester till 15 September because we want to do an on-campus teaching. For 2 semesters, we've struggled with online teaching, and we realized how difficult it is, where we had the money to provide dongles and actually provide recordings and have Zoom licenses and you name it. The other universities could not do it, and even we struggled with it. Teachers were not prepared. Students were not ready. Accessibility was weak. Electricity issues existed. And the whole, see, online teaching is not something you pick up a mic and you start doing it. You need to be trained for it. And it has always been a distant second to face-to-face teaching, despite the advancement that happens, which essentially means that this brought to the society, this face-to-face interaction brought to a society a certain kind of stability, or it's a need, it's a requirement. I think I hate talking to a machine. I would like this to have happened in real time. And the opportunity is that you can sit in London and she can sit at AFN and I can sit at IBA and we can connect. And that's fantastic. But at the same time, I miss the real interaction that emanates from gatherings like these. And same goes for classroom teaching.
Yeah. Well, I think worldwide, economic and social progress has been set back, but by different amounts in different countries. The economies will take longer to recover in some areas than in others. And you're suggesting that in the particular case of gender and education, it could be 20 years of progress that has been lost.
I'm not saying
because of that.
That's a report that's come out, actually.
Yeah. Anjum.
Thank you. So I would not disagree with Huma when she says that this disruption has taken us back, not just us, but the world back in terms of the education gains. There's no denying of that. There's also no denying of the fact that this disruption does not affect just the girls. It affects all students, be they boys or girls. It affects across the board. But in the case of societies where, which I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks, where there are specific roles and expectations for girls. And so, for example, there are studies coming out that during this period, early marriages for girls have been planned and they have undertaken. These early marriages will have devastating effects on the life cycle of these young women. And so those effects will be there, and we have to, as a society, we have to set up and take notice of how do we mitigate those events. As a society, we have to, and as a school education system, we have to take a look at how do we ensure that the young people who come back to the education institution, their learning losses are not taken as one size fits all? Because as I mentioned earlier, those young people coming from with an educated mother in the background, research in the although it was in the case of devastation and earthquake, but we can extrapolate here, they will have a different kind of learning loss, and their re-entry would be different as compared to children who may not be having an educated mother at home, who may not have any of the digital devices that Huma very very well pointed out. I would also point out that again, that's the optimist in me, that this has resulted in some very creative ways of ensuring how do we reach out to the most marginalized. So while the data bundles and all of those were being utilized, we also looked, for example, that the universities, Aga Khan University, for example, has a number of students spread out in the remotest northern mountainous regions. We partnered with some of the higher secondary schools there, and we said the schools which are in the close vicinity, they are higher secondary schools, they have their own computer labs. Could the students access those computer labs because the students themselves do not have internet and other facilities at home? So those creative solutions were also tried out. But I would agree generally that we need to sit back and have a much more systemic conversation about how the education system will move forward, and how do we ensure that the gains made for the girls' education, those small steps taken, do not actually turn into steps backwards.
Yeah. I mean, in the UK, and I think in other European countries, there's a lot of debate about the priorities that should be given to the economy, which includes education on the one hand, and simply coping with the health aspects of the pandemic. And I was just wondering what your views are on that in the Pakistan context.
Okay, is that for me? I can
Yes.
take it.
Well, both of you really.
All right.
Yes.
So there are certain steps which are being taken. So we have the SARS program, which is part of a very large social development program undertaken by this government. We have within that program the SARS scholarship for undergraduate education, which gives extra incentives for girls to participate in that in education through those scholarships. We have within the Benazir Income Support Program in Sindh, the Wasila-e-Taaleem program, which also gives conditional cash transfers. And the condition is that students, and these are for students in the poorest of the poor, remote rural circumstances, the condition of cash transfer is not just enrollment, but completion of an education cycle. So those structures which are already in place, I believe we should learn from them and enhance them, because creating new structure in this time of austerity and pandemic is more difficult. It would be better if we strengthen and enhance those positive systems and structures which are currently seen to be working at the government.
May I come in on that, David?
Yes, please.
Okay, yes, I totally agree with Anjum that yes, there are several such initiatives, and we also have nice fancy names for them. But my issue is that I think most of these initiatives are for economic sustainability, and they don't focus the education, and they definitely don't focus girl education. And I don't think there is a strategy to make sure that we address how COVID has impacted the girl child or her education and bringing her back into the mainstream. It's for economic sustainability, nutrition, food. I think those are largely the thrust. Even the SARS program, it talks about it talks about giving money. For example, Sania Nishtar announced it. I spoke to you about it the other day also, that if you carry a girl child, I mean, if a girl child is born, you'll be given some more money for 2 years. And if it's a male child, 1,500, 500 less. I have two problems with this. It is very pronatal policy. In a country like Pakistan, can we really incentivize having more children? I have serious issues with it. And that is where I think a more holistic approach is required when we try to, and I'm sure the government has very good intention, but can we afford this? What kind of impact is this going to happen on families? Maybe we will stop voting girl child, but will that girl child go to school, or are we creating more problems? I think that is basically, Anjum, my issue here, that we've taken initiatives, but we are not looking at how COVID-19, this particular pandemic, is going to impact the situation. And we've learned from Ebola and other pandemics that the most difficult situation arises for vulnerable groups, the disabled, transgender, girls. And one of the challenges is just bringing them back to school. Just that.
Yeah.
And I don't think there is a strategy to do that. We are not looking at we are looking at incentives to letting them remain alive, which is fine, which is very good. So that you have the incentive to have a girl child and let her live, because for 2 years you will be given money for it. Fantastic. But what is beyond that? So do we have a holistic approach? And I think that holistic approach is lacking. That is my submission through this forum, and for people like Anjum to sort of look at it.
Thank you.
Okay, so Huma, I would not disagree with you on the need for having a uniform holistic strategy for education across the spectrum. So not just the basic education, not just the K-12 education, but the higher education. I would also say a slight disagreement that some of the initiatives that the government has taken do have a specific education focus.
Absolutely.
The SAS, for example, scholarship has a very education focus, and also the Wasila Talim. But
even the World Bank shift, the World Bank shift actually has a component on education.
Yes.
So I'm not, please don't miss, I'm not discounting all of that.
Yeah,
I'm saying the trust for, but we probably need a more holistic approach where we see how do we handle the fallout of the pandemic on girl education. That is my thrust. I do not disagree with any of that.
Agreed, but I would...
Okay, so let's have Anjum and then Huma, and then we'll open to questions.
Okay, so I would say that girls' education or education in this country itself has not been a high priority over the decades. And that is reflected in the current status of the education system in the country. Whether you see what is the percentage of GDP spent, whether you look at the quality of the governance, management, monitoring of the education systems over the 7 decades or so that the country, we may boast of a quantitative expansion, but qualitatively the system is in crisis. And that's why I would say that it's not just the case of what is happening as a result of COVID. COVID, in that sense, it's a point where we are sitting up and taking notice of what will happen to education. Will the girls come back? Will the poor children come back? Will the schools be able to accommodate all of its student population while maintaining the standard operating procedures for safety? All of those questions are becoming open, are being discussed. I have never seen them being discussed at a governmental level before. In fact, I have never seen education as having a debate on education before to the extent that we are having now. So, Huma, I agree with you. Education as a priority requires a strategic response from all sectors, not just the public sector, but also from the academia, not just not just for the K-12 sector, but also for the undergraduate and higher education sector. So couldn't agree more, yes.
Right, thank you. So just last word, and I'd love to hear questions now. You see, I always used to say if there's one emergency this country needs, it's education. I think post-COVID-19 has complicated it. Because you see, it's one, we are giving out very few degrees. And the second question is, are the degrees worth the paper they're written on? You see, that is my concern, and especially in public sector universities. What is that degree doing for that person? Is it preparing him to enter the market, be a better human being? That entire debate, So I think already education in Pakistan, with all due respect to all those people who are committed, and I've been with the sector for 25 plus years now, I think education in country like Pakistan was already in storm, with all due respect. And we just need to go on war footing to make sure that COVID-19 does not make it worse. That's about it. Last comment. Thank you.
Okay, so we have some time now for questions and comments from, I'm not sure how many people, but I'm sure people are participating across the world, both from Pakistan, from the UK, and hopefully elsewhere. So the first question that came in is for both people, but it was prompted by Anjum's initial remarks, and pointing to two things that people often talk about in Pakistan: the feudal system and religious orthodoxy. How far have these had a particular impact on girls' education? I should thank Ghulam Abbas for this question.
So I would say both of these issues have had an impact on the practices in the Pakistan education system. But then I would also turn around and say that education would be the strategy, a quality education would be the strategy to break the hold of feudalism and to enable, I'm very much, and to break the impact of the religious orthodoxy, not of the religious education, but of an orthodoxy. So an open attitude, an questioning attitude, and education that enables children, both boys and girls, to question the hierarchical structures in our society, hierarchies on the basis of feudalism, hierarchies on the basis of gender, hierarchies on the basis of a post-colonial legacy. All of these need to be questioned. And I think that because we have inherited a system of education which still has the legacy of our colonial past, that system of education was structured to create two-layer class-based society. One that would rule and the other that would be ruled. And if the education system does not break that mold, then the rulers, be they a certain orthodoxy, be they feudalism, be they other power structures, the system of education will only serve a few, but will not be a system to open the gateways of opportunities for the masses. So that those two have been an influence on the education system. And I would say a genuine reform in education would be an approach to break those shackles.
Yeah. Huma.
David, I just totally agree. And I think Anjum has given an extremely comprehensive response. And I'm now sounding like a broken record here. But I'm going to again say something slightly more provocative. You see, Pakistan has undergone a transformation in the sense that from an agricultural society, we are urbanizing at a pace which is at an unprecedented pace. So, and for example, Karachi has urbanized or experienced migration, which has not happened to any country anywhere in the world. I think very few people know that. But at the same time, Karachi is also a city that houses the largest slums in the world. And you see this nice talk about social distancing and health and care. These slums are are places where people just sort of struggle to survive. And in these places, the government had acquired 70% enrollment, and that is starting to reverse. So that is my concern, very, very major concern here. So feudalism, patriarchy, and of course, on the religious front also, we've taken 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. Once again, Pakistan is now doing this debate on single curricula for all the countries. They say it's the floor and not the ceiling. But at the same time, there are issues and people have serious reservations about what is a single curricula for all the schools across the country. So I think once here the threads of religion run into the single curricular paradigm and nation building and all of that, which actually prevents critical thinking, questioning, which is so essential to education. And I think that is the debate which is never done in Pakistan. We never talk about teaching students to ask questions, because unless we do that, STEM will never happen.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. And of course, if one was going to compare Pakistan, let's say, with Bangladesh, East Pakistan as was, the huge gap that has opened up in literacy levels in general, female literacy, female schooling is quite extraordinary. And I'm sure that the issues that we've just been talking about are at the root of that. Now, there's a question that I think is, first of all, for Huma, from Mehreen Hussain, and she asks, the pandemic has heightened the digital divide globally. We were just talking about that. In Pakistan, there is an additional gender dimension to the digital divide with online efforts to address education. Has the girl child been disproportionately affected? I suspect the answer will be yes, but I'm sure you'd want to say a bit more to that.
Well, for example, even if you look at the statistics of access to mobile telephony, so mobile telephones are becoming a great substitute for both banking and education in the third world countries. Pakistan lags behind. And I think it can be where I can pick up the optimism that Anjum was talking about. It can be an option, because smartphones can be made very cheap and can be a source for dispersion of education. Are we doing it? The answer is too little, too late. Sorry.
Okay. And Anjum, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. So while I agree that mobile technology is opening up opportunities, as we see in Pakistan, I have seen it in East Africa, where I worked for so many years. We will have to work aggressively to ensure that the advantages of the mobile technology reach out to the young women as well. So there is a certain statistic which says that in terms of access, again, 35% less young women as compared to young men would have access to mobile phones in Pakistan. So that 35% disadvantage is already there. And that disadvantage is because of cultural modes which look at access opening up for girls differently as compared to boys. So even to be able to reap and harness the opportunities of what the mobile technology will provide, we will still need to ensure that we grapple with with pushing the boundaries of culture.
Yeah. What about, can we talk a little bit about the curriculum? Is the curriculum in some sense systematically oriented towards male concerns? Are there things that can be done either by altering the focus of the curriculum or by, in certain cases, even having elements that are gender specific that will improve the situation? Let me ask Anjum first on that, and then Huma.
Okay. So I would say several things on this, and this does not just specifically to the single national curriculum, but curriculum generally, that we have to look at the curriculum at least from four main areas: the curriculum goals, the curriculum process, the curriculum content, and curriculum evaluation. Now, no matter how beautiful the goals may be, if the curriculum content and process don't align themselves. Process, teaching methodology, what are the resources that you pick up, what are the curriculum materials that you pick up. If they are not aligned, and I gave you the example from my research in mathematics classrooms in the country, it's the same curriculum, but delivered very diluted to the girls. Because if you set the bar very low for the girls and say, why do you need to study calculus? Because you are not going to become an engineer or a pilot. Already the curriculum process has diluted the same, but it's different for the boys and the girls. That's one. Secondly, I told you, I did give an example again from Pakistan school system that in curriculum process, the curriculum delivery, the teacher is a very significant role player. And if these teachers in the girls' schools do not have adequate academic and professional qualification and preparation, then already there is a gendered dimension to the delivery of the same curriculum. So that's one. Secondly, in our cases, examinations generally are because very much of a bygone era. They really test knowledge recall, and knowledge recall doesn't really promote thinking, problem solving, and therefore that kind of examination disadvantages both the boys and the girls.
Yeah. Huma.
Okay, so Anjum had a very academic response to it. And of course, I thoroughly agree with everything she's just said. My only comment on this particular question is that I think Pakistan has constantly struggled with politicization of the curricula, where distortion of history or manipulation of history, inducing it or relacing it with religion when it suited, then the whole politics of language. So we went to all Urdu, to English, to national language, to all of that. So I think that Pakistan has suffered from so much politicization that it's become a bit of a mess. So from studying civics, when I was growing up, we've gone to studying Islamic studies. There's nothing wrong with that. But, it has just changed the thrust of what we're trying to achieve in the society. So the objectives, I don't know if, Anjum, they've been very noble, if I may say so.
Okay, right. We're almost at the end, but there's another question that has come in that, if you like, is the $64 million question or repeat question, which is budget and money and resources, and how can we tackle this question while the percentage of GDP that's devoted to education is so low, and are there ways, creative ways we can get around that?
So if I may go on that first, because I'm sure Anjum will have a fantastic academic response to that. Well, my response to that is that I'll win a Nobel Peace Prize if I could find an answer to that. And if anything, the budget for education by this most populist government, so to say, which was supposed to give hope to the street, has actually gone down. Whether it's higher education or it's tertiary, lower middle class education. Another very extremely politicized aspect of this is that who comes to power? And you know that Pakistan for half of its life has been ruled by military dictatorships. So when military dictators are in power, with all good intent, they want to invest in higher education. So we had Musharraf's era of HEC creation and a lot of PhDs in the public sector and all of that. And when elected governments come into power, they say, this is not our vote bank. We want to invest in rural education and primary education. And this grasshopping and lack of consensus and direction has impacted whatever little funds that are allocated to education to begin with. So very, very politicized response to that, David.
Yeah. True.
Okay. So can I build on that?
Yeah. Go ahead, Anjum. Yeah.
So paucity of funds is one very big issue. Government allocation, inadequate allocation of funds to education. is a very big issue. I was listening to another such webinar or debate where the chairman Higher Education Commission confessed that this is the worst time in the history of higher education in terms of the budgetary constraints that they are facing. But I would also like to point out to another issue, which is the elephant in the room. How are those funds spent? Even the little amount of funding that is allocated to the school education system, it is misspent, it is unspent, there is no accountability of the funds spent, and therefore to ask for more funding without taking account of even how those little funds are being spent. If you look at and I'll give you an example. If you look at why the low-cost private sector schools are so popular as compared to the government schools, which are bigger in terms of building, they are spacious as compared to these schools. These schools, the governance and monitoring systems are much more in the private schools. Even the small, low fee charging private schools, the governance and monitoring is very close to the ground and very stringent. Whereas in the government schools, that is lacking. No accountability of funds, no accountability of resources, and therefore to then ask for more funding without even taking stock of where the allocated funds are being spent, to me, seems only part of the solution, part of the problem, looking at part of the problem.
Yes, so I'm so tempted to come onto this. So yes, I think it's more of an issue of academic governance than anything else. So Pakistan suffers from ghost teachers, ghost students, ghost schools, you name it. And she's absolutely right. I couldn't agree with her more that it's not about, yes, very little funds are allocated to education. There is panicity of funds. The focus is not there, all of that. But whatever little money is allocated is not well spent, and there's zero accountability. And more importantly, I think the state has taken the responsibility of educating the people, and it's a constitutional responsibility also. Our constitution says that, but at the end of the day, the public sector education is in a state of complete disarray, in fact, collapse. And in that vacuum, private education has moved in. So people who are even slightly affording would go to a low-cost private school. So I think we just need to revamp our academic governance, right from primary education to tertiary education. And now even low-cost tertiary education has come as an option. So Iqra University probably houses as many students as Karachi University, which is the largest, oldest public sector university in Pakistan. And the delivery is somehow better at the private university than at a public sector university because there's no accountability. Yesterday, Prime Minister Imran Khan actually came out on the television after the completion of his 2 years in office, and he said that our biggest drain is not the circular debt. I don't know if you understand this, David, but I'm sure our audience in Pakistan do. The biggest drain is pension. And then he mentioned pensions in educational sector, in the education sector. So these are basic academic governance, fiscal governance issues that is also negatively impacting the flow of all of this.
Okay, well, we have come to the end of our time. I know we could have gone on for quite a lot longer because we've been looking at the big picture. We've been looking at very specific issues. As always, I'm afraid we've focused on some of the real difficulties that have been there for the last 73 years, but we've also looked at some positive initiatives, some areas of change. Huma, of course, has told us quite rightly that governance, both at the macro and at the micro level, is absolutely critical to the situation. And of course, COVID across the world has simply brought these issues into sharp focus. It's reduced the level of resources that's likely to be available. It just has created a completely unprecedented situation. It's good that we can have these discussions through these webinars to see if there are ways forward. And I'm sure we'll continue the discussion. So first of all, thanks to our two panelists, Anjum Halai, Huma Baqai. Thanks to the people who sent in questions, and thanks to everybody who's been online for this event. So thanks very much, and I'll sign off.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.